the last part of the report, that is on regulation on soft law, possible instrument to tackle the media pluralism and freedom issue. And so this is the part about what few ideas we had about what to do. And Elda will start telling what we are going to write in this report. Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. My presentation is on the possible legal instruments to tackle media pluralism and freedom. It's an outline on what we wrote in our report here at the CMPF on European Union competencies in respect of media pluralism and media freedom. And my presentation is linked with the presentation that Paola Gori, Costantina Bagna, and Professor Mastroianni gave in the previous session. Because, first of all, Paola Gori in her presentation gave the state of the art of the application, let's say, of the principle of media pluralism and media freedom at a European level. As she said, the treaties do not confer an explicit competence to the EU on media pluralism and media freedom, but in many occasions the European Union has not been neutral on the issue of media pluralism and media freedom. And the debate on the competencies of the European Union with regard to media pluralism and media freedom is a long debate which is still ongoing. The fact that we are here and we are debating on the possibility of defining a competence on media pluralism and media freedom is the evidence itself that the question is not solved. And the evidence of the debates going on is that for instance, Vice President Neelie Kroes in 2012 established a strategy instituting with different policy and research groups, the Center for Media Pluralism and Freedom, Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom, the EU Future Media Forum, and the High-Level Group on Media Freedom and Pluralism to discuss and report on the state of the debate and what can be done on the issue. And another evidence that the debate on media pluralism is still alive is the bottom-up approach that is used by the media, the Citizen Media Initiative on media pluralism. There is a very important interest from the citizens on media pluralism, and this citizen initiative qualifies this interest. So media pluralism is a principle that can operate and be implemented at various levels in the European Union order. This is what we try to demonstrate while making the list. Paola gave in her presentation a list of cases where media pluralism was used as a principle that was used by hard law and case law at the European level. And our goal is to make a list of potential instruments of potential intervention of the European Union according to these potential instruments, beside the fact that, of course, the European Union has no specific, explicit competence on media pluralism. So we tried to find out what we could use of the legislation in force in order to foster, to to foster media pluralism at a European level and find out how to create an environment that is and to create occasions for fostering media pluralism at the European level. First of all, we had a look, of course, at the constitutional level of the EU law and the treaties. Article 11 of the Charter says that explicitly states that the freedom and pluralism of the media shall be respected. So explicitly, freedom and pluralism of the media is mentioned in this article. Then Article 6 of the Treaty of the European Union states that the Charter had the same legal values as the treaties. But, as you know, this does not mean that the European Charter the Charter for European Rights extend the competences of the Union as defined in the treaties. So the provision of the Charter are not to extend the competences of the Union as defined in the treaties. What's the aim of the Charter? The Charter is addressed both to the EU institution, bodies, offices, agencies, with due regard to the subsidiarity principle, and to the Member States when they are implementing the European Union law. Article 52 of the Charter affirms also that the Charter contains rights which correspond to rights guaranteed by the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. The meaning and scope of those rights shall be the same as those laid down by the said Convention. This provision shall not prevent Union law providing more extensive protection. So Article 52 makes this first link with, between the Charter and the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights. So another Bill of Rights acknowledged by Article 6 of the Treaty of the European Union is the Convention for the Protection for Human Rights itself. The Union shall accede to the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. The Union hasn't acceded so far. By the way, fundamental rights as guaranteed by the European Court of Human Rights as they result from the constitutional tradition common to the Member States are to constitute general principles of the law of the European Union. So from what we said, from what we listed, the Charter, the European Convention of Human Rights and constitutional tradition of Member States form a normative corpus that has already had and will potentially have a role in the interpretation and application of European law. How? The two European courts, the European Court of Justice of the European Union and the European Court for Human Rights, can play an important role in the definition and in the application of common European principles starting at case level. In this way, I think we can make a link with what Professor Mastroianni said in his presentation. A case that is a bright example of the possibility of linking, of using this interpretation of the two courts for a new case is Cable Deutschland of October 2009, that it was stated before Lisbon. Even it was stated before Lisbon. Another element that we listed, in our report, another possibility is the one that Constantina Bania already presented. So competition and cultural aspect, the interpretation of Article 167, paragraph 4 of the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union. So I'll skip this aspect. Another possibility to tackle pluralism, to foster pluralism, beside the fact that there is no explicit competence by the given to the European Union, is through internal market harmonization. Some authors think that through Article 26 of the Treaty of on the Function of the European Union and Article 114 of the treaty, internal market harmonization, we could find somehow a way to foster pluralism. What these articles say? They say that the European Parliament, the European institution, Parliament and Council shall adopt the measures for the approximation of the provisions laid down by law, regulation or administrative action in Member States, which have as their object the establishment and functioning of the internal market. The European Union can exercise its competencies whenever the proper functioning of the internal market is negatively influenced by the existence and application of diverging national provision in any sector which is not expressly excluded from the founding treaties. The main regulatory instruments that the member state use to protect media pluralism in the media market is legislation on media ownership that usually prevents and sanctions the creation of a dominant position in the market. There are different parameters to define position prejudicial to pluralism. For instance, the number of channels, the control channels, resources, audience share. And for this position, for this literature, all these differences can hamper the functioning of the internal market, and their existence may be detrimental to the free movement of services or the right of establishment, since operators may find it difficult to establish or provide services in another member state where dominant positions are in place. And this is the position held by the European Citizen Initiative. The European Citizen Initiative, as you know, fostered the implementation of media pluralism principle through a directive on ownership. And the same reasoning may be applied for media ownership transparency. So through internal market harmonization, we can foster media pluralism and even in ownership transparency field. And in a perspective of the Jurecondendo, in shaping these new provisions of harmonization, the Union is required to uphold the highest level of protection to fundamental rights as guaranteed by the EU legal order, in particular the freedom of information as enshrined in Article 11 of the Charter. This competence related to the one that we already see. Another element that we stressed in our report is the difference between the regulation of electronic communication and audiovisual media services. Audiovisual Media Service Directive does not foresee the establishment of relevant independent national regulatory authorities. So we made a comparison between the Electronic Communication Regulatory Framework and the Audiovisual Media Service Directive related to the governance of each market, and we found out, of course, what is blatant, that the national regulatory authorities provided by that are described in the communication package are quite different from the ones that are provided by the Audiovisual Media Service Directive regulation. The Audiovisual Media Service Directive does not introduce any specific obligation for the member state, nor does provide any element about the structure, functioning, or role of those national bodies that have to regulate the market, or about the relationship among them. In the era of convergence, it could be reasonable to consider the establishment of the same institutional requirements both for electronic communication and audiovisual media services, especially when we have to deal with with the contents. It could be reasonable to have NRAs that are at least independent from markets power and from political powers. Another possibility of intervention in the media pluralism sector is through the use of some existing bodies, as the European Agencies on Human Rights or another qualified body, to set soft law standards, to find a way to standard setting and monitoring on media pluralism in Europe. So what we found out, and what we found out also in some literature, and is that pluralism could be fostered through the activity of the Fundamental Rights Agency, which so far has no explicit mandate on this issue. So our conclusions are that European Union competences with regard to media pluralism appear scattered in the European legal landscape. The European Union has few hard and soft law instruments to promote and assure media pluralism and freedom in Europe. But given the paramount importance of the democratic principles to be promoted, greater clarity and certainty is needed with regard to European Union competences.
Okay, thank you, Elda. We have now Marco Bassini and Oreste Pollicina. I don't know how they are. You are starting. Okay.
Let me thank once again Professor Parku and the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom for this invitation. When a few weeks ago we received this invitation, Oreste and I tried to figure out how to develop this presentation in order to answer the research question that we are trying to face as to the regulatory approach to adopt, to use with respect to media convergence. And we decided to focus on two markets and two sectors where the impact of convergence can be seen, and with respect to the electronic communication market on one hand, and with respect to the audiovisual media services on the other hand, and try to look at the approach adopted by the European Union and member states in this regard to understand the regulatory approach and to question whether such a regulatory approach should be extended to the internet, that is the medium that, of course, brought significant consequences in terms of convergence. So our question is, should a different approach be used to regulate the internet, as we are experiencing a really fragmented, really scattered legal framework as to the internet. And the internet brought really serious consequences in terms of convergence. Let me first make some point with respect to convergence. What does convergence stand for? What does convergence imply? Convergence resulted in the field of media in the dismantling of the traditional distinction and separation between media and services. In the past, certain media could be used to provide certain services, and the same service could be only provided by use of a certain medium. Nowadays, this situation has been overcome, as the same medium can be used to provide more services. The same different services can be provided by means of different media. So from an economic and legal point of view, convergence resulted, of course, in integration of the relevant markets and had very important consequences, not only with respect to competition issues, but also from constitutional point of view with respect to the protection of fundamental rights in some cases. Let me first focus on the electronic communication market, where we have a very strong approach by the European Union in the last 20 years, and we have seen a very important legislation aimed at fostering competition in a market where in member states there were monopolies in the past, and where the objective pursued by the European Union was fostering competition, allowing new operators to enter into this market and to start to compete with the incumbents. And this regulatory approach, in certain cases, was based on the imposition of obligation on the incumbents, was based on the purpose of fostering competition and protection of end users, so in order to create competition in the market. And how convergence impacted? We can see the impact of convergence in the different provisions that were enacted over the past years in this sector by the European Union. And we can see today a legal framework concerning the electronic communication, where all the systems and networks that can be used for the convenience of television or radio programs are covered by this legal framework, even if some provisions with respect to the content are posed in most of the cases by member states. On the other hand, we have looked to the audiovisual media services in another important field, where the impact of convergence can be an interesting issue as starting point for our reasoning. And with respect, the most important signal of the convergence in respect of this market is the extension of the scope of the television without frontiers directive to the audiovisual media services, and that are covered by this legal framework. But from this point of view, we can observe a different approach by the European Union. The legislation was aimed at the same purpose, fostering competition, reducing the asymmetries and disparities, but there was just a limited area where the European Union legislation directly intervened. And my reference is to the area of commercial advertising, protection of minors, and the European quotas. And this approach is reflecting the objectives that the European Commission posed in the European in the communication on the future of the audiovisual media policy that has been cited in the previous interventions, and where the Commission had stressed the importance to safeguard media pluralism, the right to information, cultural diversity, and the pluralism, the access to information. So this is an area where the member states are regulating other aspects, such as the authorization or licensing regimes, and the area of the legislation covered by the European Union is focused on certain topics. And our questions, having said that, having looked at the different approach adopted by the European Union in respect to telecommunication and electronic communication on one hand, and with respect to audiovisual media services on the other hand, is should such approach be extended to the regulation of the internet? Because the internet has brought significant consequences in terms of convergence, as I've said. And our question is, how should the internet be regulated? Because today we have a very limited legal framework. We have the e-commerce directive that regulates the information society services. But there are many forms of interaction between, for instance, audiovisual media services and the internet. And this poses a problem for us. And in the end, we need to try to answer this question. And Oreste will illustrate this problem.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks very much for the invitation. In the light of what has been mentioned above, it's clear that broadcasting on the one hand and electronic communication sectors on the other are characterized by a European regulatory footprint, if you can put it in this way. What is still missing in our discussion about media regulations in times of convergence seems to me to focus clearly in a provocative way on a possible European regulatory approach to the medium that better than others illustrates the said convergence, clearly the web. The coming of the internet posed the questions of whether the regulatory regime applicable to the traditional media, in particular telecommunication and broadcasting, should be extended to the web-based service. Problems especially emerge as a result of the development of the already old, by the way, Web 2.0, when internet started to be used to provide additional service than the original ones. Now, against this background, seems still relevant to question if there is a European vision, a certain European idea, if you can put in this way, or a European common policy with regard to internet, as we've been existing on one hand for electronic communication, on the other hand for broadcasting. The answer is yes and not. Depends clearly, first of all, on the terminology, how we can define internet, which are the relevant areas that we consider of internet, because by an attempt of simplification, you can divide the internet components in service, infrastructures, standard, and content. With regard to service and infrastructure, we can find an attempt to have a more comprehensive regulatory approach. For example, if you look to the infrastructure, clearly net neutrality has a European vision that vis-à-vis the USA net neutrality vision. And with regard to service, Information Society Directive and e-commerce directives give a kind of, at least an attempt of regulatory approach with regard to service. As we will see in one moment, with regard to the content dimensions, the regulatory approach is much less developed. But independently from the single components of the web, what seems that is still missing is, as I said before, a certain European idea of internet with regard to the regulatory approach, despite the efforts of the European Commission, in particular in comparison with the European approach that is in a way characterizing the electronic communication and the audio-visual service. For example, for instance, if we look at the communication of the Commission of 2003, we see that they clearly affirmed that the European regulatory audiovisual policy has to safeguard certain public interest, such, inter alia, the right to information, media pluralism, and the protection of minors. Now, we can say the same for internet. If the answer would be affirmative, then clearly would be affected in our discussion the issue of the European regulation of content. For example, with regard to the need of the identification of a European model of freedom of expression that must be for sure much more limited than the USA counterpart. We regard the need of balancing between fundamental rights, between freedom of expression and other fundamental rights that are conflicting. By the way, it's exactly in the content dimension of the web that there is a lacking of a common European approach, of a European common policy, if you can put in this way. The reason is quite simple. In general, when you speak about content, you speak about constitutional values that tend to be protected in an autonomous way by the single constitutional regimes. But if this is an assumption that is unchallenged before the explosion of the digital era, let's say in an offline world, with the advent of internet, there is a risk of spillover transnational effect, with the consequence that the domestic constitutional issue need to be reconsidered within a European framework. Also, with regard to the relevant provision of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights that has been recalled earlier. In the light of this scenario, there are at least 4 emerging issues or problems related to the need of a more comprehensive, systematic approach with regard to the European common policy in internet. The first one, the example of webcasting of user-generated content. The growing of user-generated content platforms such as YouTube demonstrates that the stricter convergence between traditional broadcasting service and internet, and in part pose the problem of whether the performance of such activity may be subject to the legal requirements that are provided for the broadcasting sector. Am I referring in particular to the provisions related to the protection of minors, advertising, and European quotas? As you know, the Iure Condento is something that the internet operators are very worried about. Second problem, what could have happened if the video anti-Muslim, so-called video, would have been censored in a non-homogeneous manner, not outside Europe, like it happened, but in Europe? Who is deciding about the homogeneous way in which freedom of expression should be exercised? An external regulator or the platform itself? This is the second question. The third one. If in other regulatory framework sectors, for example, broadcasting, there has been a virtuous combination between positive integration and negative integration. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. In particular, it's been recalled earlier, the impact of the ECJ case law that has been more effective on the anti-competitive situation in Italy than 40 years of constitutional court case law. But if in the internet policy, if in the broadcasting and communication, electronic communication, this in a way can work, for sure it cannot work with regard to the internet policy, because the risk to have an inertia of the legislator could not be compensated in any way by an activism of European courts, for the simple reason that this would make emerge an asymmetry in the enjoying the fundamental freedoms, a violation of legitimate expectations in areas which have a constitutional implications. Last problem. We are absolutely aware about a possible objection and disadvantage of this option, a more regulatory, comprehensive approach for internet in Europe. It could appear a nonsense with regard to a phenomenon that is by definition transnational and global, and the negative concrete implication of this approach could be seen with particular regard of the proposed regulation on data protection proposed by the Commission, not still adopted, where it's provided an extraterritorial application of the legislation with regard of all the persons that are residents in Italy and to whom the data belongs, independently of how the servers are situated. And clearly here the problem is a dichotomy between a European regulatory approach that could work in theory, and then the enforceability and the enforcement of the law. And so the problem that this regulation probably will not be taken so seriously by the not European companies. But also having absolutely aware of it, on the other hand, it's difficult waiting for a world agreement of, let's say, global regulation to focus only on self-regulation as a standard that I think in many areas is not anymore acceptable. Thank you very much.
We give the floor to Annette. Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just before we have to terminate this nice day, I'm pleased to be able to speak here again on the invitation of the Florence School of Regulation and, of course, your nice center. Yes, I think that my presentation will take the perspective of institutional design and the difference between telecoms and media regulators, and it is really sort of following also the route of my previous speakers on convergence, where I will show you that the current distinction between telecoms and media seems to be rather artificial, taking into account all the developments in the technical and market way. So what I will show to you is present you how their distinction is made at the moment, what sort of models of institutional design we could use, and I'll end up with a case currently pending before the Netherlands, because the European Commission started last week an infringement procedure against the Netherlands exactly on this specific point of distinction between media and telecom regulators. So I'll show you what the consequences could be. Yeah, first of all, I think it is also mentioned during the day that there are many differences between the situations in the member states, and also on the part of the institutional design, there's no single model. This is because of the autonomy of the member states so far, that not only in the telecom area but also in the media area there are some rules but not that many concerning the institutional design. And of course there is a correlation between regulation and institutions and the way they are designed and designated with powers and instruments. You mentioned also the enforcement. Of course, if the institutional design is not in order or the enforcement instruments are not there, the regulation as such is an empty shell. So there is a basic correlation between the two. And what you see so far is that the current structure in many member states is a result of historical and political developments, and really based on more old market structures. So it is very important to distinguish between institutions on the one hand and the authority to intervene on the other hand. And I will mostly present it from a more telecoms regulators perspective, as that is my field where I'm currently working in. And I would like to maybe have some comments from the more media related areas where most of you are presenting. But an integrated regulator is not there in many member states. There is, of course, Ofcom in the UK where we can see that, but in my member state, the Netherlands, you have a specific distinction between the media regulator on the one hand and the telecom regulator on the other hand. But even if they are integrated in some areas, that does not mean that they have also integrated regulation they are applying. Mostly due to European legislation, the regulation as such is still distinguished. So even if they're under one roof enforced, that doesn't mean that the regulation as such is already converged. So that's another element you have to keep in mind. For the Netherlands, just to give you an example, we have OPTA, the telecom and post regulator, and this regulator is implying and applying the telecommunications directives as had been mentioned today. On the other hand, we have Commissariat for the Media, which is the media regulator, implying, for example, the TV regulation from the European level. And you can look at that from different angles. Maybe it's good that we have two different regulators, sort of regulatory competition between the two, so they keep on sharp and having some competition. On the other hand, you can imagine, what does that mean, the division of tasks? Are they enough coordinated? Is there some overlap? And what is the effectiveness of having two regulators in an area where the markets are converging every day? But the traditional view of the regulation, I think this is clear from all the presentations of today, that you have the TV media on the one hand and the telecommunications, and there are not that many crossovers in the regulation as such. So there's a complete isolation of the both regimes, and as a consequence of that, the two regulators in the member states, if they're existing like in the Netherlands, they rather acting on their own, and there are not that many crossovers. So there's on the one hand more content regulation, as been discussed many times today, and on the other hand regulation from the telecoms perspective, the communication regulation, which is really focusing on the transmission of signals, so the network regulation. Basically that's black and white, that's the distinction made in the two regimes. So this is the traditional view. You have media on the one hand looking at the content or the services delivered, and on the other hand communications, where the regulation is really focusing on how signals are transmitted, what sort of networks do we have, the access to networks and the facilities, and the tariff regulation of that. So the cost-based regulation to calculate the tariffs for access to networks. And this is just as a reference for you. It's difficult to read, but there's this picture from the Rent report. I really would like to refer to that. You can find it on the Optan website, where Rent made a very nice convergence report and analyzed all the different regulatory regimes and asked whether or not we should have more convergence and what then the institutional design of that convergence should be. And here you see on the one hand the communications instruments or medium, I have to say. So what is transported, like mail, telefax, or the mobile infrastructure, and on the other hand it's the broadcasting perspective, where what is actually as the content being transmitted, and then you have the different possibilities. And on the right hand side, the transmission medium, there you see that those media are converging, and it doesn't really matter anymore whether you look at TV on your mobile or through internet, or maybe through your fixed line. So the infrastructure is converging, but the regulation as such of the different traditional networks is not converging at the moment. And I'll show you that later. Yeah, what could you have as different models for institutional design related to this distinction? Of course, you can keep it as it is, and you coordinate, make rules on coordination, what I call the coordination model. So you remain the different supervisors or authorities, and they have to coordinate the interventions. But of course, then there is this idea that they know what they have to coordinate. And that is, of course, in practice, the difficulty, where many things happen in a very rapid tempo. Things are changing, convergence taking place every minute of the day. And of course, if the regulation is not in place and not following up that, for the regulators as such, it's also difficult to coordinate that. And that's what you see happening in practice. And the other model could be, but that's not yet currently in place in many member states, is a convergent model where there's just one integrated supervisor like Ofcom, and I'll come back to that later. So the traditional model is more a model of coordination, where you have consultation, coordination procedure, or all other many instruments you can think of to make sure that decisions are coordinated whether or not that is necessary. For my own practice in the Netherlands, I see this as the supervisors, so the authorities, are very willing to do that, but they're really a bit struggling of what should they coordinate, what is exactly the overlap of the activities, and also the interpretation of the regulation as such is not always certain, and they have to find their way through that. And as long as the regulation is not well coordinated as such, it's also difficult to coordinate the interventions. So, for example, in the Netherlands we have a coordination protocol where there's many contacts between the two regulators, very good coordination and very good cooperation. but they're not meaning that that good cooperation is always aiming for solution, because mostly the solution is to be found in new regulation, and of course as a supervisor you cannot influence that process. So you have to see how, also from a European level, the regulatory regimes are changing. So if we would have a convergent model, that would of course mean that not only the supervisor is acting under one roof, but also the policy and powers and instruments are completely integrated and coordinated. And then of course that would mean hopefully less coordination, but that's still necessary if you have those two different regimes. When you look at Ofcom, the case of Ofcom, where there is really more convergence also at the regulatory level, not only at the institutional level, and they have many more powers to intervene at the different levels of the information delivery chain. And another important element is that they have also powers on the spectrum allocation. So where there is scarcity or problems about capacity, they can also influence the spectrum allocation with consequences of competition on the market. And many telecom regulators throughout the member states or throughout Europe do not have also in their toolkit the spectrum allocation powers. And that is especially where the convergence takes place also on the mobile markets. This is really a handicap you could imagine. So you could say that it was also the presentations of my previous speaker that convergence would be the right solution, at least if you would like to follow the markets, but that does not mean that all the details are that straightforward how you can do that, especially related to the internet. So my interim conclusion would be that there is a need or could be an importance of integration. And where the overlap takes place at the moment, for example, the case of net neutrality, where the expectation is that capacity problems might occur, and then of course this could cause discrimination on networks, and this could also have then a content consequence. So there, I think the net neutrality case is a good example where the overlap between telecom regimes and the content media regimes do encounter and need more coordination on that field. But so far, the coordination still needs to be in place. So my key message for today is that there are differences in the institutional landscape. The institutional and regulatory landscape do need, or could, that would be a further topic for research, I think, where you could follow or investigate what are really the areas where more convergence also at the institutional and enforcement level should be necessary. I skipped the define of convergence because the previous speakers already mentioned that. I just would like to add one detail also to your view on the convergence element of the framework directive. Yes, in theory, on paper, they are aiming for convergence also at the network levels, but still, if you look into the details of regulation of the different networks, you could wonder whether this convergence is already taking place, that all the networks are considered at the same way. Yes, and then we have to live with the distinction the regulator or the regulation at the European level has made for us between the distinction between media and telecommunications or communications, and what does that mean in practice. And I'll illustrate it with a case currently going on in the Netherlands. So in theory, on paper, yes, there is a strict distinction between content on the one hand and content regulation, and on the other hand, transmission. So if this is a case about transmission of signals, you only deal with the telecom regulation and the telecom regulator. If it's about content, you're talking about the media regulations and the media regulator. But what if the two might meet each other somewhere in the middle? Who is then competent or has the power to intervene for what? In the Netherlands, we have this strict distinction where Opta as a telecom regulator is not, according to the framework directive and the Dutch implementation legislation, not competent or has no powers to intervene regarding content regulation. Opta is the only regulator for all the implementation of regulation as the framework directive, as mentioned. And so far, for example, on the cable access regulation, also through intervention by the European Commission, there's no regulation as such on the cable sector, for example. And you see then in some areas where there are private regulations and private agreements on that, but Opta is standing out of that. What happened is that in the Netherlands new legislation was introduced because the parliament thought that the non-regulation of the cable sector, as was a result of many litigation in the Netherlands and the intervention of the European Commission, was not satisfactory. So a new legislation was introduced where not the telecom regulator, but the media regulator was asked to impose the access to the cable network and the tariff obligations. So by national legislation, so not following the European implementation process, this new legislation was introduced. And the Commission, and then the media regulator was appointed as the competent authority. The European Commission is not agreeing with this legislation and arguing that the telecom regulator, Opta, is the only competent or exclusive competent regulator according to the European framework directives to implement transmission of the signals and also the access to imposing access obligations to this network, and that the national legislature cannot circumvent that by media regulation. And last week on Thursday, the Commission launched an infringement procedure against the Netherlands following this line of reasoning. And the key question here is whether the obligations imposed in the new Dutch legislation, where the media regulator has to give access, or obliging to give access to the cable networks, whether this access regulation, whatever you want to call it, should be qualified as transmission or as content. So if this case would be followed on, then we might have more criteria or more clearnesses or transparency on in which cases you have to deal with media regulation, in other cases you deal with telecommunication regulations. There's another case currently pending before the European Court, I just mentioned as a final conclusion, where the same sort of question is raised by the Amsterdam Court of First Instance to the European Court of Justice. And there, I won't go into the details of the case, but also there, one of the key questions is this concerning content regulation or is this transmission? And again, this is about the tariff situation of the cable industry in the Netherlands. So those two cases, I think, illustrate the difficulties with the current distinction in the regulatory frameworks of both media and telecoms regimes. And you could wonder whether this is an artificial distinction or not. The court has to give the final judgment on that. But at least to conclude, I think that from whatever perspective you look into the institutional design and the regulatory regimes, you will have these difficulties as long as there's no real convergence at both the regulatory level or the institutional level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annette. We have our last speaker, that is Federica Casarosa. Yes.
Okay, being the last means that I'm the person that really stands before your relax and drinks and cocktails, and so I will try to be as quick as possible and as precise as possible. But a small caveat at the beginning, because I want to, first of all, to thank for the invitation, but also to refer this presentation to the overall project that is MediaDem, that is Media Freedom and Independence, where it's a 7th framework program which I'm part of as the UI team, and we have a thorough analysis of 14 countries, and the comparative report is the basis upon which I have
present you this selected suggestion regarding soft law instruments. So I would like also to make sure that this is not just my work, but it's a work of several researchers also here in the Institute, among them Professor Fabrizio Cafaggi and Professor Tony Prosser from Bristol University. So it's not just my work. So the outline of the presentation, I will just provide you a short description of soft law, because it's a very difficult concept, and what are the already used soft law instruments that are used in the European context, and provide you the criteria for the selection of soft law instruments, and a few suggestions, the most relevant part. What about soft law? I just I've just mentioned two of the well-known definition of soft law, and it concerns rule of conduct, which in principle have no legal binding force, but which nevertheless may have practical effects, Snyder in 1994, and commitments, which are more than policy statements, but less than law in a strict sense. So you have different definition of soft law by different scholars, and but the main aspect that characterizes soft law is the fact that they are rules of conduct, and this should be interpreted both in terms of content and in terms of writing style. So it's not just a description what is positively done, but how normatively it should be, and not binding. So it's something that has no binding force, or very limited force, and this is not to be interpreted as a lack of enforcement, rather as an adoption of different forms of enforcement, such as soft enforcement, as been defined, and depending on the type of the tools that has been used has been used by the policymaker, and the practical effect is implicit. So you have some practical effect. So you influence the behaviors of those targets that are of the soft law instruments. So in that sense, you have they can be used in a pre-law function, or a post-law function, or a parallel function. So soft law instruments are very, very useful when you have, for instance, to test if a kind of approach can be shared among member states, that has in the European context has been used, or post-law, in order to make sure that some guidance is given on very general principles, or at least additional, so not concurrent, but parallel elements that could help in the understanding of some hard law instruments. So it's here. That is why I have in my first slide. I slightly changed the title of my presentation, like soft law as a starting point, or as an easy way out from the competence conundrum, because here the competence is less relevant, because you don't have some binding effect. So member states could, in the case of EU, could have less constraints to appreciate soft law instruments instead of hard law. So in this case, we have already several soft law instruments adopted by EU. So as before was presented by Hilda and Paula presentation, there are several interventions by the EU that has been used, that has been adopted through the soft law instruments. And here you have a long list of them. And this is not comprehensive. On the one hand, this list is not so comprehensive, because obviously it can include other, that is the etc. in the lines, but it can also be reduced, because not all of them in each of the cases are soft law instruments. And as was mentioned before by Roberto, also the Council of Europe has already used soft law instruments with regards to media pluralism in particular, from the recommendation in 1999. So it's a very relevant part of law that could be used with regard to media pluralism. And depending on the objective pursued, the instruments can be selected to achieve it can be different. So we have the presentation, the very first presentation by Alina, that clearly exemplify the difficulties in defining media pluralism, which are the different facets that are within this concept, so we can clearly address different aspects, so for external and internal pluralism, political and cultural pluralism, diversity of output or of sources, independence, and several other aspects can be included. So the point of soft law instruments in here should be taking into account what is the very specific issue that you want to address, or if you want to address a very wide issue, it's important to be sure that which are the target that you're addressing. So if you want to select the right soft law instrument, you have to be clear in mind a wider regulatory strategy in the pluralism to address media pluralism. So here it's very relevant that the EU, wherever wants to use soft law instruments, really have a clear idea. And few suggestions, just 3 slides, but I hope that would be interesting for this audience. First, the first issue that I want to tackle is the use of existing institutional bodies. As I saw from the ELDA's presentation, they have already taken into account the fact that independent regulatory bodies are not required in the AVMS directive. However, there is a specific forum that is the contact committee that has been set by Article 29 of the AVMS, where all the regulatory, national independent regulatory authorities should be participating. And the task of the contact committee is to facilitate effective implementation of the VMS directive, deliver opinion, discuss the outcomes of the Commission consultation, facilitate exchange, and a long list of tasks. The point is that at the moment, since the adoption of the directive and the creation of this contact committee, the activity of this forum, where at least there should be some kind of activity by a sharing of experience by different national regulatory agencies, authorities, is not really relevant. They just look at just making tables about how the implementation has been done, how it has been adopted. In particular, one of the recent meeting was about the self-regulatory and co-regulatory arrangement at national level regarding the non-linear service that are very relevant, but given that we have already an institutional body that could provide some kind of normative guidance to national regulatory authority, why not using it in order to make sure that at least an exchange or best practice among national regulatory authorities can be used? The other suggestion that has been also made by Hilda and Paula is the role of European Fundamental Rights Agency. In that case, I see more difficulties because the current remit does not include at the moment media pluralism, nor more generally freedom of expression, because it's just look at privacy issues and other, and what is more gender and LGBT, etc. So they are very specific issues, specific areas of fundamental rights to be tackled. And it is difficult to extend it because it has a 5-year program. So if it is renovated, it is renewed, it could really be a good place to have some kind of effect. But again, the role of the European Fundamental Rights Agency is to provide expert opinions or to have a kind of again, exchange of good practices, or provide also opinions to member states. But still, here we have it's a more difficult area where to tackle. Another area where I want you to think about. It's the, obviously we have already several presentations about technical convergence, not only Marco and Oreste, but also in the first, and Annette, but also in the second session we have several presentations about how the technological convergence has has been, he's working and he's going on. So, but in this case, I want to point to the increasing roles for citizens, users' voice within this technical convergence. So, the relevance of citizens in the new environment. Sorry. At the same time, we have the emergence of new intermediaries. So, search engines, etc. We have, thanks a lot, sorry. The emergence of new intermediaries. Here, search engines and content aggregators are very relevant. And here we have a modification of the supply chain for information. So we have new subjects that enter into the production of content at different phases, either in the production itself, so we have citizens that provide for user-generated content, but also intermediaries that are in the distribution of this content. And at the same time, we have a step towards the proprietarization of content. We have, if I remember well, Giovanni that was mentioning that Yahoo is going to have a content production, so becoming a content producer instead of just a distributor of content. So in that case, and if I remember well, this happens also not only through the creation of content, but also through the integration of social media and bloggers within the supply, the information supply. So, in that sense, what is the place for citizen voices within this proprietarization process? So, we have to be sure that at least the citizens, so blogging, is not just voices that are then included in commercial. So what was the original place of the obligation to provide space for civil society groups in order to guarantee pluralism is public service broadcasting. If public service media start again to provide the same service, should they be, I use the term subsidized, but in this case it's very difficult to express how it should be provided, so in which way this kind of help or space for citizen participation in public service media. So they should, for instance, the promotion of user-generated content should be provided through audience content and comment, collaborative content, network journalism. Should they be part of this approach? And again, how to protect and support citizens' voices in content aggregators? Should we, one of the problems that was mentioned also before is professional and non-professional journalism. Should we differentiate in the content aggregator between those who have professional journalists or not? So here, I'm sorry, I'm making more questions than providing solutions, but it's still it's very difficult to define specific solutions for very general problems. And finally, one thing that should be also addressed is private regulation. Here, as was mentioned also before by Oreste, if I remember well, you have a significant role of private regulation in all media sector, but you have self and co-regulation in press and broadcasting, even less in new media. So we have to think about how, for instance, the EU could provide guidelines in addressing, so indirectly addressing the private regulation that is currently in place at national level in order to make sure that, for instance, some very general elements are safeguarded. So regulatory independence, fair enforcement procedure, and here the EU can clearly adopt the blueprint of what was already done by the DG Sanco on health issue. So in that sense, they could really make, they have already a template to work with. So The issue is still just these are very few suggestions, and I hope that it just make you some kind of interest in this relatively limited area.
Thank you, Federica. As I said, we have a few more minutes, very few minutes, but we open the floor for if there are questions to the. Yeah.
I'd like to address this to Annette. With apologies, she might have mentioned it. I have to multitask because I'm flying back into a closed city. So some of the reasons why regulation might actually shift from from the content to the platform are that it is the least mobile. That is, unlike content providers, it cannot be offshore easily and move around. And secondly, there's only a small number of these entities, much smaller than content providers. Thirdly, they can be taxed in a way that you cannot tax. Therefore, kind of the nexus of regulation, of financial and other regulation is there. There is also a reluctance to deal with the content in terms of regulation for historic reasons of free speech, whereas the platform is an easier nexus for regulation. And so there's a whole range of reasons why I believe that regulation, in fact, is going to shift from the content to the platform.
I can only agree with that. So thank you for your comment.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but if we put together the presentation of this afternoon, I've been confirmed in an idea that I already had, that is, and I would like to know if this is true or not, that European Union is interested in pluralism as, how to say, an economical dimension, an economical issue, and not as a political or cultural or social issue. As far as I understand, and we discussed with Beppe Richeri over lunch, is it true that the European Union doesn't have the power to intervene on the issue of pluralism again, as political, cultural, and social issue, while they have, and they are more interested in the economical dimension of this problem? So, I don't know who can be answered to this question or whatever it is.
I think that maybe today we raised also the economic issue because you have to look at the thing from the very beginning. We are looking for competences. So you are like looking at an issue and saying, okay, we want the EU to intervene and let's look where we can find space for intervention. And very often when you have to deal with EU law, it's because of the, let's say, when you think about the European Union, the first argument you have is the internal market argument. And Constantina, before she introduced this Article 167, where cultural aspects were taken into consideration. But you're right that we spoke more about economic issues than democratic or political issues, but it's, let's say, done in a, really because it's the only space we found to see some competences, together with Article 11 of the Charter and Article 10 of the European Convention.
Mario Timer from the Fundamental Rights Agency. I was very interested by the discussion today. I just wanted maybe to clarify one point and have a question on the scope of how do you foresee basically the role of the agency? The clarification first. I just wanted to point out, first of all, that the first multi-annual framework will end at the end of this year. And basically, the next 5-year program is already more or less, I mean, not agreed yet, but quite advanced in discussion. However, it seems to me that following the discussion, for instance, on the Lisbonization of our multi-annual framework, it's clear that now we will have to go through a change of regulation, funding regulation, in order to be able to incorporate former third pillar issues. That's why I was wondering whether you were actually thinking of suggesting introducing the question of media pluralism within the change of regulation, which I think would be probably more realistic than only an amendment on the multi-annual framework. But this is just a suggestion of my part. Now, I'd like to, I mean, too bad that the elder left also, but I wanted to understand what was exactly the suggestion, or what were the suggestion of where would you see the added value of the Fundamental Rights Agency's work in this area?
Well, obviously, the idea in my presentation was to make sure that, given this competence problem, the existing institutional bodies that are at least working in the fundamental rights area can provide additional and at least provide some expert opinions and intervene in the legislative process and provide and steer the decision towards the protection of freedom of expression and eventually media pluralism. It's not just a matter of just stepping in and saying, well, we provide this regulation or whatever. It's just a matter of exploiting the expertise and the work that has already been done in a through a specific institutional body. That is the way. Obviously, operationalizing it, it depends on what is if I remember well, the Fundamental Rights Agency works either for the EU and for national member state upon request. So if the Fundamental Rights Agency work as an harmonizing, as in implicit harmonizing tool, because it provides the same opinions throughout member states, it could really help harmonization in an indirect way. That is the possible choice through in terms of media pluralism protection. That was my position, my idea, but I can.
Basically, it was the same. I mean, our idea was to extend the scope of the agency and maybe use the agency to monitor member states or to set some guidelines or principles. Of course, it's soft law, it's not hard law instrument, but this is something very clear.
I would, lawyers used to start with cases and go to, to general rules. And I haven't seen the cases. I mean, if you look at Hungarian case or Italian case, you could exactly see what the EU could accomplish by using legal framework or which it couldn't accomplish. Instead of starting with the abstract things like social scientists do, just go to cases. I mean, Hungary shows you exactly the awkward way in which EU could act in situations when there is violations of or accusation violations of media pluralism, and the way in which they try to use, for instance, competition with little effect to basically to achieve its aim.
Just feel obliged to say a word about the regulatory authorities, because they have been mentioned very often, and as you may know, there's something called the European Platform of Regulatory Authorities, which is a group of the regulators, content regulators, I should say, who convene twice a year to really exchange best practices, problems, try to find ways forward. I think they have existed nearly 20 years. There may be a better, sorry to say that to the Commission, but maybe a better place to look for than the Contact Committee, which is highly directed by the Commission and by its needs and by its next report that they need to fulfill. And so I would really encourage you to think, when you, especially with soft law and building practices and common sense, to look to that. And then secondly, it has been said that the Audiovisual Media Service Directive does not require independence of regulatory authorities. That's true, but that doesn't mean that they are not independent. It just means it's not in that law. I mean, just be careful from, you know, deducting something from which is not regulated. There are for other reasons, actually, there are other political backgrounds that explain that quite well. And sometimes you have a regulatory authority which on paper looks like, whoops, they are somewhere very closely linked to the government and they cannot be independent, but when you actually experience them and see how they operate, they are extremely independent because they have a culture of being left alone. So it's really, really tricky there to look on the paper and not to compare that to the real world. That's one issue. The other thing is also it has been said that convergence should maybe lead to also converge regulatory authority, and then we always hear about Ofcom and how powerful and how great they are. Yes, but I mean, compare the size. I think, I mean, they have recently had to downsize, but I think Ofcom employs something like 1,800 people. Huh? I mean, it's not so surprising that they are quite powerful. So it's also how much a country puts into that. And then even if they're converged, there's another converged regulator, also called Ofcom actually, BARCOM, it's the Swiss regulator. They're also converged on paper. They have their individual departments. So it could be that they are converged, but still one department does telecoms and the other one does content. Again, the real world looks quite different. Third example, a content regulator, one of my favorite, I have to admit, just because they are brilliant in what they put out, is the Belgium CSA, that means the French-speaking community of Belgium. What they put out, you would be really surprised. Look at their website, it's great. You would think they have at least 300 people. They have 27. So I just want to urge you, you know, whatever you get really tested against the real world, come. The EPRA is actually hosted by the observatory, so I invite you to Strasbourg. I think I can thereby speak in the name of my dear colleague Emmanuel Maché, who is the secretary to the EPRA, and get the information from how they think they could maybe position themselves and bring that, if there is still a point to do that, into the study. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to make a few comments on that. I think you're completely right that there's an important distinction between de facto and de jure independence. So lawyers have the sort of mostly look only at the de jure angle, and I completely agree with that, that in practice it might be completely different or even the other way around. So about convergence and regulators, the only thing I've been trying to do is presenting you different models. I didn't say that one model is better than the other. I just presented examples of Ofcom on the one hand or the Netherlands where they are distinguished, and it might depend on the regulation, on the cultural background. So I didn't choose for one or the other. I just wanted to make clear that to you, and it's really depending on also the instrument. And even if they're under the same roof, as I stressed again and again, it's depending on the regulation and how they're able to coordinate. And it's most of the regulations coming from Europe, so you have, you're restricted there what you can do as a member state. So that's in addition to your comment.
I take, yeah. Sure.
Sorry, just a short remark. You're perfectly right regarding the EPRA. They are a very relevant institutional body. I haven't touched that body because, in that sense, the EPRA is it's difficult because it has members that are not within the EU. So whatever. No, it's not a matter of having competencies to provide to work for harmonization, but in that sense would have difficulties in implementing those guidelines. And in the same sense, if you look at the statute, they don't have the power. They don't have the power to issue guidelines. Whatever document is provided, it's a general document. It's a paper that is provided within the relevant meetings, but it's not for purpose. It's not something that is not it's not conscious. It's for purpose. It's not taken as a guidance for national regulatory authorities. So in that sense, it's more tricky. They should change the approach and issue guidelines or issue instead of the contact committee where this regulatory power is already there. Okay.
Sorry, but the contact committee has no regulatory power. It's just not true.
Well, let me get the last 2 minutes to conclude. Let me start from the Professor Zielonka consideration. It's not that, at least I'm speaking not for the discussion, but for our policy study, the cases are behind the reflection. Clearly, we start from, and I would say that also the demand of the Commission to have a policy study about their own competencies is because there are cases. Clearly, when you have to make laws or regulations or soft laws or intervention, you cannot face cases that are already there. You have to think to the future. So somehow that's the way in which we have tried to face this thing. So the idea was to start from an inventory of possibilities, of laws, of legal situations, and then maybe through moving through all these areas, first, as I said this morning, starting from trying to define the concept and to measure, or to define also how to measure the concept of pluralism and media freedom, then through the economics environment that was obviously heavily changing, as we had in the discussion also today. So try to contextualize all this effort within a realistic framework. What we tried really was to go for a search for competencies. So we started from the negative word that we all somehow have said, that it looks like the EU has not primary or not full and not primary competencies, but still has a feeling of a need of competencies. So that's the effort we tried to make in this policy report. And considering the discussion of today, I have a feeling that, and it's an happy feeling, an encouraging feeling that we are within the boundary of the debate. The debate that I heard today shows that we are not at the frontier of any of these boundaries, and that's reasonable because we were writing a report for the Commission, so we cannot be on any extreme boundary. We should be on solid, for what we can, on solid ground, but it looks like the discussion is around the same issue. Still, I think that today we had some good ideas and some good suggestions that we could try to put together and somehow to re-elaborate in the report, and on this I think we are very grateful to the discussion. And so both on some models of how to define pluralism and how pluralism is changing in this new environment, some more economic suggestions also about the relevance and the new angles of the economic situations, and also some suggestions that we had this afternoon about the legal issues that are also important to think about. I think we have we got ideas and suggestions that we may use to improve. Let me say that this report has been, as a first draft, given to the Commission, and we got their comments. Then as a second draft, the draft on which we were working today, we have given it as an input to the A-level group that is going to conclude its own works and to do its own report. So now what we are planning to do also on the basis of the discussion of today is to go for a third release that will be a final release and a public release of our report. And then we'll see if the Commission can find some help in what we have in, let's say, what I define as a search for competencies, even if it's a difficult search considering the complexity of the issues that we have to face. And I think this concludes my final remarks that are within the 3 minutes I promised. Let me mention that for the people that don't have to escape, there is a cocktail. So who is not escaping as a cocktail here? Let me thank again all of you. And for the ones that are going home, have a safe trip home. Thank you very much.